What's going on, everybody? Welcome back. This is Guys at Magic, and I am your host, Dave. Today, I'm going to be taking you through a deck tech of Auntie Blyte, Bad Influence. She's one of the new legendary creatures from the Jumpstart 2022 set. If you haven't done so already, please make sure that you like and subscribe this video. Follow us here on our channel. Also, do me a huge favor. Go back and check out our Jumpstart 2022 grades and hear a little bit about our thoughts and opinions of these legendary cards as well. So, with that being said, we're going to go ahead and dive in. I'll go ahead and explain what the card does and then talk about a little bit about the direction that I wanted to go with the deck. Auntie Blyte is 2 and a red for a total of 3 mana. She's a legendary creature, Devil Advisor. It has flying, and it says, whenever a source you control deals damage to you, put that many +1/+1 counters on Auntie Blyte, Bad Influence. She also has an ability where you can pay 1 and a red and tap her to remove X +1/+1 counters from Auntie Blyte, and it deals X damage to any target. She comes in with base power and toughness of 2/2. So, Auntie Blyte is going to be able to hit the board relatively quickly. She's only going to be 3 mana. She's got some nice evasion there with the flying ability. And although she's not really the biggest threat, at least not to begin with, over the course of the game, we do hope to hurt ourselves and to be able to spread that misery around a little bit. Being able to basically use her as kind of like a Voltron commander to be able to beat her opponents down with. And then in the case that our opponents do start to build up board presence, maybe we're not able to get in effectively with combat damage, we can always use her second ability there to just start hitting our opponents by removing those counters. So with that being said, we're going to go ahead and dive in. These are some of the creatures that I have included in this. Essentially, we're going to break it up into a couple of different categories. The first category of creature that I want to talk about are creatures that are going to help us by hurting us. Essentially, these are all going to be creatures that are going to deal some point of damage to us. The first one here is Volcano Hellion. This is 2 and 2 red. For a creature Hellion, it's a 6/5. It says it has Echo X, where X is your life total. Probably never going to be able to afford this unless I guess you're on your deathbed, which is not going to be all that difficult for you to be able to do with this deck. Its second ability, however, says that whenever it comes into play, it deals an amount of damage of your choice to you and target creature, and then that damage can't be prevented. Not only does this act as a really solid piece of removal, with you being able to pay life and hit something really hard, but so long as your Auntie Blyte is in play, you're going to be able to throw a ton of +1/+1 counters on her. Go ahead, hit yourself for 19, put those 19 counters on her, and then all of a sudden you have a 21/21 flying commander that is ready to go kill somebody. So Volcano Hellion is a huge threat in this deck. Next up here we have Spear Spewer, much more smaller than the last one. This is just a single red mana. It's a 0/2 creature goblin warrior. It's got defender, and you can tap it to have it deal 1 damage to each player. The really wonderful thing about this is you're included in that. So every time you tap Spear Spewer, not only are you bringing the game a little bit closer to its resolution, you're hurting your opponents just one little piece at a time, but you're also putting that +1/+1 counter on your commander. Cemetery Gatekeeper is 1 and a red for a total of 2. It's a creature vampire. It's a 2/1 with first strike, and it says whenever it enters the battlefield, exile a card from a graveyard. It also says whenever a player plays a land or casts a spell, if it shares a card type with the exiled card, Cemetery Gatekeeper deals 2 damage to that player. So a nice little piece of flexible removal here for your opponent's graveyard. You can potentially nuke one of their pieces that they might be looking to recur later on. In addition to that, you can also just feed into this by starting to cast spells or play lands, depending on whatever it is you exiled out. That way you're hurting yourself too. Defiler of Instinct is a new card. This is 2 and 2 red. It's a creature, Phyrexian Kavu. It's a 4/4 with first strike, and it says that as an additional cost to cast red permanent spells, you may pay 2 life. Those spells cost a red mana less to cast if you paid life this way. This effect reduces only the amount of red mana you pay. It also says that whenever you cast a red spell, Defiler of Instinct deals 1 damage to any target. So it's got 2 different modes on here, both of which are pretty relevant in being able to deal damage to us while also getting a little bit of a cost reduction for us too. Fire Slinger is 1 and a red for a creature wizard. It's a 1/1, and it has a tap ability where you can tap it and have it deal 1 damage to target creature or player and 1 damage to you. This is always going to deal at least 1 point of damage to you. You can, I guess, tap it and then also be the target of it too, so it'll deal 2 damage to you. Once again, we're really just kind of playing these cards in here to be able to bump up our Auntie's power and toughness. Lastly, kind of the king of pain, and although some people aren't really too high on playing this card, I just feel like the upside is way too powerful here for us to not include him, is Heartless Hidetsugu. This is 3 and 2 red. It's a legendary creature ogre shaman, a 4/3, and you can tap him to have him deal damage to each player equal to half that player's life total rounded down. If everybody has 40 life, he'll deal 20 damage to everybody. That's going to put a huge amount of counters on Auntie Blyte. It actually, in the case you haven't already gone to combat, is going to put your opponents within that lethal range, because Auntie, of course, getting those massive number of counters is probably going to be able to just kill somebody. So Heartless Hidetsugu is going to help to close the gap out pretty quickly for all of your opponents. It's going to bring their life totals crashing down, and Heartless Hidetsugu on his own has a tendency of eating a lot of removal spells, a lot of hate, so that's one less removal spell potentially going towards your commander, which is always great. The next category of creatures that I'm going to talk about are all designed for kind of utility purposes in this deck. They're not necessarily designed to deal damage to us, but they do help to smooth a couple of things out. The first one here is Torbran, Thane of Red Fell. This is 1 and 3 red for a total of 4 mana. It's a legendary creature, Dwarf Noble. It's a 2/4, and it says, if a red source you control will deal damage to an opponent or a permanent an opponent controls, it deals that much damage plus 2 instead. So helps to hurt us a little bit more, helps to also hurt our opponents a little bit more. Ketis Emberclaw Familiar is a fantastic card in this deck. It is 1 and a red for a legendary creature elemental wizard. It's only a 1/1 on its own, but it does also have an ability that says whenever a commander you control deals combat damage to an opponent, it deals that much damage to each other opponent. So if we're attacking in with a big old Auntie, it makes sure that we're also being able to hurt each of our other opponents, the guys that we're not attacking. Harsh Mentor is in here. It is 1 and a red for a human cleric. It's a 2/2, and it says, whenever an opponent activates an ability of an artifact, creature, or land on the battlefield, if it isn't a mana ability, Harsh Mentor deals 2 damage to that player. This sadly is not going to hurt us, it's not going to bring our life total down, but if we are hurting everybody throughout the course of the game, Harsh Mentor will be able to get in at least a little bit to kind of put an additional amount of pressure on our opponents. Plus, we really want our opponent's life total within kind of a 1 to 2 hit range for Auntie, and Harsh Mentor helps to close that gap. Neheb the Eternal is 3 and 2 red for 5 total mana. It's a legendary creature zombie Minotaur warrior. It's a 4/6 with a flicked 3. It also says that at the beginning of your post-combat main phase, you add a red mana to your mana pool for each 1 life your opponents have lost this turn. If we're dealing a massive amount of damage, that's great because it means that Neheb is creating a massive amount of mana for us in that second main phase. So that's going to be wonderful for us. Make sure that we can continue to pump out all the other goodies that we happen to have in the deck, and just be able to make sure that we're beating down. Goro, Disciple of Ryusei, is 1 and a red for a legendary creature Goblin Samurai. It's a 2/2. The first ability on this card says you can pay a red and creatures you control gain haste until end of turn. The second ability allows you to pay 5 mana and create a 5/5 red dragon spirit creature token with flying. Activate only if you control an attacking modified creature. That actually is important in this deck. We're going to get to the equipment later on, but just kind of as a bit of a spoiler, we're going to want to put the boots on Auntie, so there's going to be plenty of opportunities for modified creatures in this deck. And then of course I love that first ability, being able to just give our Auntie or any of our other big creatures haste. That way it's a little bit more difficult for our opponents to prepare for blocks. The last 2 creatures we're going to talk about that'll wrap up this category are Lizard Blades, which is 1 and a red for a total of 2 mana. It's an artifact creature, Equipment Lizard. It's a 1/1 with double strike. It says the equipped creature has double strike, and it's got a reconfigure cost of 2. You can play this as a creature, of course. It's primarily in the deck, however, to be able to give Auntie double strike. Make sure that we're smacking in with that really, really big creature. And then the last utility creature here is Iron Mirror. This is 2 mana for an artifact creature mirror. It's a 1/1, and you can tap it to add a red mana to your mana pool. So kind of just functions as a essential, just like another mana rock for the deck. Now, if you haven't happened to notice already, a lot of the creatures going to be including this deck are not necessarily all that big or really capable of being able to sit it back on block duty. Plus, we're probably not going to want to be using Auntie for blocks. We want to make sure that she's getting in and dealing damage. The next 2 creatures are in this list because they do a wonderful job of sitting back on block duty for us while also helping to hurt our opponents. The first one here is Brash Taunter. This is 4 and a red for a 1/1 creature goblin. It's got Indestructible. It says whenever it's dealt damage, it deals that much damage to target opponent, and you can pay 2 and a red to have it fight another target creature. Generally, you can use this as just to kind of sit around as a blocker. It does have the ability just to kind of dissuade your opponents from attacking in because they're going to take some damage there. It's a 1/1 with Indestructible, which does make it a little bit more of a pain in the butt for you to be able to work around this thing. The last kind of really cool mode about this is that you can have it fight any other target creature, to include Auntie, which is wonderful because then Brash Taunter will just deal a massive amount of damage to a target opponent, so help to close out the game, potentially just kill off somebody. The next one here is Stuffy Doll. This is 5 mana for a 0/1. It's an artifact creature construct. It also has Indestructible. It says whenever it enters the battlefield, you choose a player, and it says whenever it is dealt damage, it deals that much damage to the chosen player. You can also tap it to have it deal 1 damage to itself. So it doesn't have the fight ability that Brash Taunter has. Not quite as good, I don't think. But Stuffy Doll is going to be another card that you're going to play. You're going to be able to kind of pillow fort yourself behind it a little bit because your opponents don't want to attack in and have Stuffy Doll block. The last 4 creatures in this deck kind of just provide a little bit of, I want to say, oddball support. The first one here is Platinum Angel. It's 7 mana for an artifact creature angel. It's a 4/4 with flying, and it says you can't lose the game and your opponents can't win the game. Turns out this deck at its best can be really good at hurting itself, so Platinum Angel kind of comes in as more so just like a little bit of a backup plan. Just throw this onto the battlefield, make sure that you have a way to protect it, and then it doesn't matter if your life total ends up hitting 0. Goblin Engineer is 1 and a red for a creature Goblin Artificer. It's a 1/2, and it says whenever it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for an artifact card, put it into your graveyard, then shuffle your library. It also has an ability where you can pay a red, tap it, and sacrifice an artifact to return target artifact card with converted mana cost of 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. Goblin Engineer is going to be able to make sure that you are grabbing whichever equipment you think is going to be most important, or whatever just artifact you think is going to be most important given your board state. The last 2 creatures in here help us out a little bit with card draw. The first one here is Combustible Gearhulk. This is 4 and 2 red for an artifact creature construct. It's a 6/6 with first strike. It also says that whenever it enters the battlefield, target opponent may have you draw 3 cards. If the player doesn't, you mill 3 cards, then Combustible Gearhulk deals damage to the player equal to the total mana value of those cards. So say, for example, you flip over 5 mana worth of cards in the top 3. Somebody can either have you put them into your hand, or they can have you mill those cards instead and just kind of keep them in the graveyard, but they'll take 5 damage. Combustible Gearhulk, not necessarily super impactful a lot of the time, but in a deck that does deal a lot of damage like this one, you're going to want to choose the opponent that has the least amount of life and really force them to make a difficult decision. Do they want to drop even lower or help you out with that card draw? Lastly here we have Sin Prodder. This is 2 and a red for a creature devil. It's a 3/2 with menace, and it says at the beginning of your upkeep you reveal the top card of your library. Any opponent may have you put that card into your graveyard, and if a player does, Sin Prodder deals damage to that player equal to the card's converted mana cost. Otherwise, put that card into your hand. So kind of similar to Combustible Gearhulk. He's much cheaper. He only costs 3 mana, and then also having menace on that is kind of relevant too. He might be able to sneak in for some extra damage here and there. That's going to wrap it up for our creatures. Next up, included in this deck, we've got to talk about some of the instants and sorceries, some of the spells that are going to make this deck really start to hurt. The first category we're going to talk about are spells just dedicated to making sure that we are dealing damage. The first one here is Earthquake. This is an X and a red for a sorcery. It says Earthquake deals X damage to each creature without flying and each player. So not only are we going to be able to pump mana into Earthquake to hurt ourselves, but we're also going to be able to make sure that we're starting to kill off some of the other creatures. We can use this kind of like a board wipe. And Auntie Blyte is going to get so much bigger because all of the damage we're going to deal to ourselves here is going to put +1/+1 counters on her. Similarly, Rolling Earthquake is also in the list. This is X and a red for a sorcery. It says that it deals X damage to each creature without horsemanship and each player. Same thing, this is going to hurt you. It's going to be able to put some +1/+1 counters on Auntie because of that. Now, do keep in mind, this one hits all creatures without horsemanship, which in a typical game of Magic should probably be just every creature. But creatures with flying will still get hit with Rolling Earthquake. Flame Rift is 1 and a red for a sorcery. It says it just deals 4 damage to each player. So for 2 mana, you get to hurt your opponents for 4 and throw 4 counters on Auntie. Wheel of Misfortune is in here. This is 2 and a red. It says each player secretly chooses a number 0 or greater. Then all players reveal those numbers simultaneously and determine the highest and lowest numbers revealed this way. Wheel of Misfortune deals damage equal to the highest number to each player who chose that number. Each player who didn't choose the lowest number discards their hand, then draws 7 cards. Essentially, you can use this either just to hurt yourself, be able to put those counters on, or be able to also restock and refill that hand of yours. Brotherhood's End is a new card in this that I'm quickly becoming a huge fan of. This is 1 and 2 red for a sorcery. It's modal and it has choose 1. The first mode says Brotherhood End deals 3 damage to each creature and each planeswalker, or destroy all artifacts with mana value 3 or less. Now, sadly, you're not hurting a player with this, and you can't hurt yourself with it either, so not necessarily super synergistic, but it is modal in a sense that you have the ability to either destroy pretty much everybody's mana rocks and kind of support artifacts, or you can go in and you can use this as a small end board wipe to clean up potentially any tokens, any small blockers that your opponents may have, get rid of all them chumps. We do have a single dedicated board wipe in the list, and this is Blasphemous Act coming in. It is 8 and 1 red for a total of 9 mana. It says it costs 1 less to cast for each creature on the battlefield. It deals 13 damage to each creature. Blasphemous Act absolutely can kill Auntie. However, there's going to be situations that Auntie might actually still be able just to survive Blasphemous Act because she's going to get so big. So I love having a board wipe that potentially doesn't actually set us back by a ton. The last card that is included in just like making sure we're optimizing our damage is Seize the Day. This is 3 and a red for a sorcery. It says untap target creature. After this main phase, there is an additional combat phase followed by an additional main phase, and it's got a flashback of 2 and a red for you to cast it an additional time from your graveyard. Once Auntie gets big enough, Seize the Day should be able to just close the game out for us. Make sure that you attack in with her, cast it, attack in with her, flash it back, and then attack in with her, all before your opponents get the opportunity to take their next turn. The next group of instants and sorceries that we're going to talk about are going to help us smooth out our deck a little bit. The first one here is Big Score. This is 3 and a red for an instant. It says as an additional cost to cast this spell, discard a card. It says draw 2 cards and then create 2 treasure tokens. So helps to be able to filter our hand a little bit while also making sure that we can ramp a little bit too. Faithless Looting is a single red mana for a sorcery. It says draw 2 cards and discard 2 cards, and it has a flashback of 2 and a red that allows you to pay for it. Cast it from your graveyard. Thrill of Possibility is 1 and a red for an instant. It says as an additional cost to cast this spell, discard a card, draw 2 cards. Gamble is going to be included in this list. It's a single red mana for a sorcery. It says search your library for a card, put the card in your hand, then discard a card at random, then shuffle. And then lastly in here is Jeska's Will. This is 2 and a red for a sorcery. It says choose 1, but if you control your commander as you cast a spell, you may choose both. The first mode on here says add a red mana for each card in target opponent's hand. The second mode says exile the top 3 cards of your library and you may play them this turn. So it helps to draw cards for you. Also helps to potentially act as like a ritual for you too. Make sure that you can cast some of your stuff a little bit sooner than what you normally would have been able to. We've got a couple pieces of interaction in this list. The first one is Wild Magic Surge. This is 2 red mana for an instant. It says destroy target permanent an opponent controls. Its controller reveals cards from the top of his or her library until they reveal a permanent card that shares a card type with that permanent. They may put the card onto the battlefield and the rest on the bottom of their library in a random order. Similarly, we also have Chaos Warp in here. This is 2 and a red for an instant. It says the owner of target permanent shuffles it into their library, then reveals the top card of their library. If it is a permanent card, they put it onto the battlefield. Both of these do have the potential to bite you in the ass, so just kind of keep in mind they could always end up upgrading with whatever it is you're getting rid of. However, Chaos Warp does have a little bit of a whiff potential. Wild Magic Surge, you're kind of just banking on the fact that whatever they're going to flip is going to be worse than what you just got rid of. Abrade is 1 and a red for an instant. It can deal 3 damage to target creature or destroy target artifact. I love the flexibility of Abrade. I feel like dealing 3 damage to a creature will kill more creatures than what most people realize, and then the ability to destroy target artifact is always relevant. And then we also have Lava Coil in here. This is 1 and a red for a sorcery. It deals 4 damage to target creature, and if that creature would die this turn, exile it instead. Super important to note with Lava Coil as well, it doesn't have to actually die from Lava Coil to still be exiled out. So say, for example, you end up dealing the 4 damage to something that has 5 toughness, and then pinging it later on with one of your other abilities or maybe one of your smaller creatures, it still will get exiled out. The last piece of interaction here is mainly just going to be for protection, and this is Deflecting Swat. It's 2 and a red for an instant. It says if you control your commander, you may cast this spell without paying its mana cost. It says you may choose new targets for target spell or ability. So if your opponent tries to use a kill spell on Auntie, you can go ahead and drop this down and switch the target of that kill spell. Up next, we're going to go ahead and dive into the many different artifacts that are going to make this deck work. The first category that I'm going to talk about is just strictly going to be for mana ramp. I'm not going to dive in and explain what all of these cards do, just because you probably have seen these hundreds of times. Included in here, we have Arcane Signet, Soul Ring, Mind Stone, Felwar Stone, and Fire Diamond. All these cards are going to be making the inclusion here just because I feel like for the most part, they're cards you really want to just include in any deck, especially in any monocolor deck. That way you can make sure that you're getting that mana ramp. I'm also going to throw in Pristine Talisman into this. It's 3 mana. You can tap it to add 1 colorless and you gain 1 life. We haven't really talked about life gain so much at this point, but it is going to be something that is really important to help make sure that we are staying alive. As we deal damage to ourselves, we don't want to actually kill ourselves off. We just want to make sure that we continuously hurt ourselves, but we do need to be able to recoup that life somehow. Ruby Medallion is 2 mana. It says red spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. So it acts as kind of like a continuous cheapener effect. So wonderful card to include, especially in a mono red deck. And then lastly here we have Heraldic Banner, which is 3 mana. It's an artifact that says whenever it enters the battlefield, choose a color. You're going to pick red in this list. It says creatures of the chosen color get +1/+0, and you can tap it to add 1 mana of the chosen color. So it serves as both a mana rock as well as kind of like a pump engine for us. This next category of artifacts that we're going to talk about are all dedicated to making sure that Auntie either connects, deals as much damage as possible, or helps to make sure that we are not going to kill ourselves off. These are all the wonderful pieces of equipment that we're going to be able to throw on her to make sure that our deck is truly humming. The first one that we're going to talk about is Basilisk Collar. This is a single mana for an artifact equipment. It says the equipped creature has Death Touch and Lifelink. It's got an equip cost of 2. That Lifelink is critically important here because it means that our commander is not going to kill us anymore. But if we do end up, say, paying 10 life to put 10 +1/+1 counters on Auntie, we can then recoup that 10 life just by swinging in. Death Touch on here also a super relevant ability, especially considering we can remove counters from Auntie to start having her deal damage to any target, which does include any of those pesky creatures our opponents may have. Shadow Spear is a single mana for a legendary artifact equipment. It says the equipped creature gets +1/+1, trample, and lifelink. It's got an equip cost of 2. It also has a second ability on it where you can pay a single mana, and says permanents your opponent's control lose hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. Resurrection Orb is 2 mana for an artifact equipment. It says the equipped creature has lifelink. It's got an equip cost of 4. It also says that whenever a equipped creature dies, return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. So, if you haven't noticed so far, lifelink being a very important keyword here. Loxodon Warhammer is 3 mana for an artifact equipment. It's got an equip cost of 3, and it says the equipped creature gets +3/+0 and has trample and lifelink. So it helps to pump us up a little bit, make sure that we're connecting and dealing that damage through trample, and then of course we're gaining all that life back. We also have Embercleave in this list. This is 4 and 2 red. It's a legendary artifact equipment. It's got flash. It says this spell costs 1 less cast for each attacking creature you control. It says that whenever it enters the battlefield, you may attach it to target creature you control, and the equipped creature gets +1/+1 and double strike and trample. It's got an equip cost of 3. Embercleave is incredibly powerful here because of that double strike and trample, really allowing us to be able to just pummel our opponent and then being able to make sure that all that damage is coming in. To help our commander out even further with this, we do have Whisper Silk Cloak. This is 3 mana for an artifact equipment. It's got an equip cost of 2 and says the equipped creature cannot be blocked and has Shroud. Keep in mind, though, that Shroud might come to bite you in the butt later on in the case you try to target Auntie Blyte. So just be mindful of that. We have Lightning Greaves in here, which is 2 mana. It's an artifact equipment, the equip cost of 0, and it says the equipped creature has haste and shroud. Swiftfoot Boots, which is 2 mana for an artifact equipment. It says the equipped creature has hexproof and haste, and an equip cost of 1. And lastly, in this kind of like protection package here, we have Commander's Plate, which is a single mana for an artifact equipment. It says that the equipped creature gets +3/+3 and has protection from each color that's not in your commander's color identity. So Auntie Blyte will get protection from everything but red. The equip for the commander only costs 3. To equip to any other creature will cost 5. There is one final equipment in this list. I just felt like it was probably too fun of an inclusion for me not to throw in here, and that's going to be Grafted Exoskeleton. This is 4 mana for an artifact equipment. It says the equipped creature gets +2/+2 and has Infect. It also says whenever it becomes unattached from a permanent, you sacrifice that permanent. It's got an equip cost of 2. So giving Auntie Blyte Infect means that she's going to be dealing damage in poison counters. So that's really going to be able to add up. That really shortens just how much damage you actually need to be able to deal. Plus, she has the ability to just start hitting things with her pinging ability too. So giving her Infect can get really scary really fast. We have 2 more artifacts in the deck. These are both going to fit in just kind of to provide a little bit more versatility and help out in some areas that I thought that they did really well in. The first one here is Crawl Space. This is 3 mana for an artifact. It says no more than 2 creatures can attack you each combat. That's great. We want to be able to minimize the amount of damage that we're potentially taking, especially considering this is a deck that we're probably only going to be swinging in with Auntie. So we're not going to have a whole lot back on block duty that we really want to be, I don't know, trading off with. Staff of Nen is 6 mana for an artifact. It says at the beginning of your upkeep, draw a card. It also has an ability where you can tap it and it deals 1 damage to target creature or player. I love the ability here for you to be able to just draw an extra card a turn. I actually even more so love the ability for you to be able to tap, be able to deal that 1 damage. You can get rid of any small pesky utility creatures so long as they have that 1 toughness. However, in a deck like this, you can always just use that ability to tap it, deal 1 damage to yourself, and pump your deck. Moving over into the enchantment package. The first enchantment that we're going to talk about is Aggravated Assault. This is 3 and a red for an enchantment. It's got an ability that you can pay 5 mana and untap all creatures you control. After this main phase, there is an additional combat phase followed by an additional main phase. And it also says activate this ability only anytime you could cast a sorcery. This is going to be a way for us to be able to take extra combat steps, and in a deck like this, so long as we're connecting, so long as we have this in play, and if we have Neheb the Eternal, we should be able to generate 5 mana per combat step. So it does create, I don't want to say an infinite amount of combat steps, but it essentially does become just infinite so long as we can keep attacking. The rest of the enchantments in here all do basically the same thing, and that is just spread misery and pain and deal as much damage as possible. The first one here is Mana Barbs. This is 3 and a red for an enchantment. It says whenever a player taps a land for mana, Mana Barb deals 1 damage to that player. Keep in mind, this is going to hurt you as well, and Mana Barbs is a card that I don't think I've ever been able to cast and not hear at least one person at the table groan. So this is going to put a target on your back pretty quickly. Most players don't like this card. Mechanized Warfare is 1 and 2 red for an enchantment. It says if a red or artifact source you control would deal damage to an opponent or a permanent an opponent controls, it deals that much damage plus 1 instead. Helps to kind of give you a little bit of extra damage push. Also make sure that any of your other things that are just going to be dealing small amounts of damage get in for a little bit more. Pyrohemia is 2 and 2 red for an enchantment. It says at the beginning of your end step, if there are no creatures on the battlefield, you sacrifice Pyrohemia. It has an ability where you can pay a red and have it deal 1 damage to each creature and each player. This card is so amazingly powerful in this deck because the way that this is going to work is you pay a red, you deal 1 damage to everything. You put a +1/+1 counter on Auntie Blyte. You pay another red, you deal 1 more damage to everything. You put another +1/+1 counter on Auntie Blyte. Essentially, with Pyrohemia in play, you can dump all of your red mana into it. It will not kill Auntie Blyte because she continues to grow alongside this thing. You can wrap up the entire rest of the board, make your commander big, make sure they don't have any blockers, and just go to town. I love this card. Roiling Vortex is 1 and a red for an enchantment. It says at the beginning of each player's upkeep, it deals 1 damage to them. It also says whenever a player casts a spell, if no mana was spent to cast that spell, it deals 5 damage to that player. And then its last ability is for a single red mana, your opponents can't gain life this turn. Help to shut down any life gain decks. War's Toll is 3 and a red for an enchantment. It says whenever an opponent taps a land for mana, tap all lands that player controls. And if a creature an opponent controls attacks, all creatures that opponent controls attack if able. This is going to help us be able to get in with combat damage, just because if our opponent does want to make any attacks, all of their blockers now have to start attacking as well. So it'll get any of those little creatures out of the way, make sure that they're not jumping. In addition to that, War's Toll and Mana Barbs, the card that we talked about earlier, work really well together. So just in case they, I don't know, want to play the game, they're going to start getting hurt. Sulfuric Vortex is 1 and 2 red for an enchantment. It says at the beginning of each player's upkeep, it deals 2 damage to that player. And if a player would gain life, that player gains no life instead. So an additional outlet here to be able to hurt and prevent our opponents from gaining life. The last enchantment included in this deck is Spell Shock. It is 2 and a red. It says whenever a player casts a spell, Spell Shock deals 2 damage to that player. So it is going to hurt you, which is totally fine in a deck like this, but it'll also hurt your opponents. And if you are playing up against a deck that wants to cast a lot of things over the course of a single turn, Spell Shock really seems to put a damper on them. All right, moving over, we're going to talk about some of the lands. The first category for lands we're going to talk about is just going to be more so focused on utility. The first one here is Witch's Clinic. This is a land that you can tap for either a colorless, or you can pay 2 mana and tap it to give target commander lifelink until end of turn. This is a land that potentially helps to save you and give Auntie lifelink, so really important, really powerful here. Hanwire Battlements is a land that you can have tap for a colorless, or you can pay a red, tap it, and have target creature gain haste until end of turn. It does have a third ability on there as well. Not even actually going to talk about it because they don't have the meld partner in the deck, so it's never going to do anything past potentially give us haste. Shank of the Blood-Soaked Keep is a legendary land. You can tap to add a red mana to your mana pool. You can also pay a red and tap to give target legendary creature first strike until end of turn. So once again, that just being your commander. And then lastly here in our utility lands, we have War Room. This is a land that you can tap to add either a colorless mana to your mana pool, or you can pay 3, tap it, pay life equal to the number of colors in your commander's color identity, which is 1, and draw a card. We have 4 more lands of note in the deck. All 4 of these lands are going to hurt us. The first one here is Barbarian Ring. This says that you can tap it to add a red mana to your mana pool, and it deals 1 damage to you. You can also pay a red, tap it, and sacrifice Barbarian Ring to have it deal 2 damage to target creature or player, but you can only use this ability if there are 7 or more cards in your graveyard. Don't worry about it. The second ability on that card, not super important, but the first ability of being able to just tap this thing, make a red mana, and deal 1 damage to yourself is wonderful. Mana Confluence is up next. You can tap it and pay 1 life to add 1 mana of any color. City of Brass similarly says that whenever it becomes tapped, it deals 1 damage to you. You can tap it and add 1 mana of any color. And then lastly here is Grand Colosseum. Grand Colosseum enters the battlefield tapped. You can have it tapped to add a colorless mana to your mana pool, or you can tap it and add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool, and it will deal 1 damage to you. So all 4 of these tap and hurt you for 1, which is great because that puts counters on your commander. Lastly, to finish up this deck, we are going to be throwing in 27 basic mountains. So that's going to go about wrapping up Auntie Blyte. Essentially, this deck is all about making sure that you're dealing as much damage as possible. If you like to be playing around with decks that either like to deal damage, if you're a masochist, maybe you just like a little bit of chaos at the table, Auntie Blyte could be a ton of fun. As always, we greatly appreciate any feedback you may have. If there's any cards that you think that I may have glossed over or didn't really go into detail for, if there's any cards that you think would be wonderful inclusions for this deck that I did not bring up in the video, do me a huge favor, make sure that you comment down below. We love any of that kind of feedback. If you totally would have built this in an absolutely different direction or think this deck is 100% not for you, still do me a favor, make sure that you leave some feedback in there that gives us an idea as what kind of legendary creatures you like us to do deck techs on in the future. Once again, if you haven't done so already, please make sure that you like and subscribe this video, and then make sure that you follow us on our other social media as well. Make sure that you follow us on Instagram, on Twitter, and of course on TikTok, where our boy Shane is pumping out mad content. As always, lots of love. This has been Dave. Peace.